The snow came early to Wyoming territory in the autumn of 1886, arriving not with the gentle accumulation of ordinary winters, but with a deliberate, almost punishing weight that pressed down on the scrub land and flattened the yellow grass before October had fully surrendered. The settlers of Crestfall watched the sky and felt in their bones what the almanac had not yet confirmed, that the season ahead would be something outside the ordinary run of hard years, something that would demand more than experience and more than preparation. Old-timers who had survived a decade on the frontier stood at their doors in the early evenings and said nothing, which was itself a kind of verdict. Edmund Hale did not see that sky. By the time the first serious snow arrived, Edmund was already dying, and the window beside his narrow bed faced east, away from the weather coming in from the northwest. So what little light reached him in those final days was pale and indirect, the light of a man looking backward rather than forward. He had been a tall man once, broad through the shoulders, the kind of man who could sink a fence post with 3 swings and carry a calf under one arm without breaking stride. What lay in the bed now was the architecture of that man. The bones still long, the hands still large, but the substance had gone out of him, burned away by the infection that had settled in his chest the previous spring and refused to leave. His 4 children came to Crestfall for the dying. Robert arrived first, as he always arrived first, to anything that required a decision, riding in on a good bay horse with a new saddle, and the expression of a man who had already begun calculating. He was 34, the oldest with their father's height, but none of his patience, and he had built something respectable on his own claim 40 miles south, a house with glass windows, a barn with a tin roof, and a standing arrangement with the railroad survey crew that had made him the most strategically positioned landowner in the county. He sat beside the bed for 20 minutes on the first evening, held his father's hand with the careful attention of a man performing a duty, and then excused himself to speak with the lawyer. Edith came the following morning with her husband, a quiet and largely decorative man named Percival, whom no one in the family had ever found particularly interesting, and she brought with her 2 covered dishes in the manner of a woman who had appointed herself in charge of the emotional atmosphere. She was 31, sharp-featured, quick to assess and quicker to dismiss, and she had decided some years ago that her role in any family difficulty was to manage the surface of things so that the difficult truths underneath could be addressed by other people. She smoothed the bed sheets, reorganized the bottles on the side table, and spoke to Edmund in a bright, carrying voice, as though he were slightly deaf rather than dying. Thomas arrived last because Thomas was always last. He was 22, the youngest of the 3 older siblings, and he had their mother's coloring. Light hair, pale eyes that shifted between gray and green, depending on the weather, and their father's stubbornness, without, unfortunately, their father's judgment. He had used his share of their mother's small estate to buy a horse and a wagon and a dog that bit strangers, and he had spent the 2 years since working claims for other men rather than establishing anything of his own. He was not lazy exactly. He was unserious in the way that young men with potential sometimes are, mistaking motion for progress and variety for growth. And then there was Clara. She had arrived before any of them because she had never left. Of the 4 Hale children, Clara was the only one who had stayed within reasonable distance of the family homestead, the only one who had not treated Crestfall as a place to be survived and escaped. She was 28, the second youngest, and she occupied a particular position in the family that had no name but was understood by everyone. She was the one who listened, the one who stayed, the one who received the confidences that the others were too busy or too proud to invite. She was not dramatic. She was not particularly beautiful by the standards that frontier society applied to women, which valued a kind of robust cheerfulness she had never managed to perform. What she had instead was a quality of stillness, an ability to remain present in a room without requiring anything of it, that had always unsettled her siblings in ways they could not articulate, and therefore expressed as mild contempt. Edmund had been lucid in the mornings and less so as the afternoons wore on. The infection did something to the boundary between memory and the present moment, And sometimes he spoke to people who were not in the room, carrying on full conversations with his wife, dead 11 years, or with a younger version of Robert, who apparently required a great deal of advice about horses. But in the mornings and the hour after the doctor's visit, when the medication had not yet loosened his grip on the present, Edmund was himself. And it was in those mornings that he spoke to Clara, not about the claim, not about the cave, not yet. He spoke first about the land itself, about what the territory looked like before the railroad survey, brought in the speculators and the wheat farmers, about a particular meadow 3 miles east of the homestead, where he had once seen a herd of elk standing in morning fog so thick they seemed to be floating. He spoke about Clara's mother, Margaret, not the Margaret who had died in stages over 2 terrible winters, but the Margaret of 30 years ago, who had crossed the Missouri in a wagon with a library of 7 books, and the absolute conviction that the frontier would eventually yield to patience. He spoke about mistakes he had made, with the claim decisions he would reverse if he could, and about the particular loneliness of a man who has spent 20 years building something and can see in his final weeks exactly which parts of it will outlast him and which will not. Clara sat in the chair beside his bed and listened to all of it. She did not try to redirect him toward the practical business of dying in the will, the distribution of assets, the various arrangements that Robert kept trying to raise and that Edmund kept refusing to address before he was ready. She simply listened, which was a thing she had always known how to do and which no one else in the family had ever properly valued. On the fourth morning, 3 days before Edmund died, he reached under the mattress while Clara was sitting with him, a motion that took effort and produced a small sound of pain. He swallowed before she could react, and he withdrew a folded piece of paper and a small brass key on a length of plain cord. His hand, when he pressed these into Clara's, was dry and light as paper, but his grip was deliberate. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face in all her 28 years. Not pride exactly and not apology, but something in between, the look of a man delivering a verdict he has carried for a long time. His voice when he spoke was barely above a murmur, and she leaned forward to catch it. "Don't let them see the map." That was all. He closed his eyes, then not in sleep, but in the particular way of a man who has said the necessary thing and can now rest. She put both items in the inside pocket of her coat against her chest and said nothing when Robert knocked twice and entered the room with the lawyer's card in his hand and a question forming on his lips. The will was read 2 days after Edmund died in the front room of the homestead, with the lawyer a dry and efficient man named Carver, who wore his hat indoors and had the manner of someone accustomed to delivering news that pleased some people and destroyed others. Robert sat with his arms crossed and his expression arranged into something between patience and expectation. Edith had brought her needlework and held it in her lap without stitching. Thomas sat on the floor near the fireplace with his back against the wall, the way he had sat as a boy, and looked at the ceiling. Clara sat in the corner chair near the window, her hands folded in her lap, the coat with the pocket still hanging on the hook by the door. Robert received the 640 acres that bordered the railroad survey, the land everyone in the county understood was going to be worth something significant within 5 years, possibly sooner. It was the choicest parcel Edmund had accumulated over 2 decades, positioned precisely where the survey markers suggested a depot might eventually stand. Robert received this with a nod that was intended to look restrained and didn't quite manage it. Edith received the accumulated savings. Edmund's silver dollars, his paper currency, his small account at the Crestfall Bank, along with the household contents, the furniture, the linens, the 7 books that had crossed the Missouri with their mother 30 years ago. She pressed her lips together in something that might have been gratitude or might have been the suppression of a more complicated feeling. Thomas received the horse and the wagon both in good condition. He looked at the floor. Clara received a piece of land described in Carver's legal language as a ravine claim approximately 4 miles northeast of the homestead proper, bounded on the north by a dry creek bed and on the south by a rock formation of no particular geological distinction. No acreage figure was given because the parcel had never been properly surveyed. The territorial maps marked it as unsuitable for cultivation or development. It had no assessed value. Robert's laugh was the first sound. It escaped him before he could decide whether to allow it, a short, involuntary sound that he covered poorly with a cough. Edith did not laugh exactly, but something shifted in her expression that achieved the same effect. Thomas, to his credit, said nothing immediately, but when Clara caught his eye, he looked away with the particular discomfort of someone who knows he should speak and can't find the words. Carver asked if there were questions. Robert said with a thin and careful courtesy that he assumed Clara understood the practical limitations of the bequest. Clara said she understood completely. Carver gathered his papers. The meeting concluded. That evening, when the others had dispersed to their various arrangements, Robert to the lawyer's office to begin the transfer paperwork, Edith to the kitchen with Percival to inventory the household contents, Thomas to the barn to check on the horse. Clara took her coat from the hook and walked out into the cold. She walked to the far end of the property, to the place where the land dipped toward the dry creek bed and the scrub land thickened into something almost sheltering. Flint followed her without being called, the gray and white border collie, moving at her left heel with the quiet attentiveness he had maintained since Edmund had first placed the dog's lead in Clara's hand the previous spring, saying only that Flint needed someone who would not treat him as a tool. She unfolded the paper there in the last of the gray afternoon light, with the wind pulling at the edges. It was a map hand-drawn on cured leather that had been cut to fit a coat pocket with lines so precise and deliberate that she understood immediately her father had drawn it not once, but many times, refining it until it reached this final version. The exterior, the ravine, the rock outcroppings, the dry creek that served as a landmark, occupied only the top quarter of the map. The rest, the larger portion, was the interior. Chambers marked with letters, passages indicated by dotted lines, symbols she did not yet recognize, beside features she could not yet name. And in the bottom corner, in her father's careful hand, a number 52 to 55. And beside the number 3 words that she read twice before she understood what they meant together: stable, year-round, confirmed. She stood in the cold for a long time, the map held flat against her palm, feeling the weight of what her father had not said in that room with the lawyer and her siblings. He had not left her nothing. He had left her something he had spent years making sure none of the others would recognize as worth having. The question was not whether to act on it. The question, the one she turned over all the way back to the homestead with Flint's breath clouding in the cold air beside her, was what it would cost to find out whether the map was the truth or the final kindness of a man whose mind had begun in those last weeks to wander. The next morning, Robert found her in the kitchen before breakfast. He had the practiced ease of a man who has decided what outcome he wants and has already run the conversation in his head. He told her in a tone of reasonable, fraternal concern that the ravine parcel was not farmable, not buildable, not sellable to anyone with functioning judgment, and that holding it would cost her in taxes and time and effort that she could not afford to spend. He offered her $20, he said 10, then watching her face revise it upward for a clean quit-claim transfer. He made it sound like generosity. Clara's hands were around her coffee cup, and she kept them there. "I'm going to look at it first." Robert's jaw tightened slightly, the way it always did when a conversation did not proceed according to his internal script. He said their father's mind had been deteriorating for months, that the attachment to the ravine was one of several fixed ideas that had emerged in his final year, that there was no shame in acknowledging that a dying man's judgment was not what it had been. Clara said she appreciated his concern. Robert looked at her for a moment with an expression she had seen before, the expression of a man deciding whether a thing is worth more of his energy, and then nodded once and left to find Carver. Edith came later alone with a different approach. She sat across from Clara at the kitchen table and spoke for several minutes about practicality, about what a woman alone required in terms of stability and social position, about the difficulty of maintaining an isolated homestead without income or support. She mentioned as though in passing that there was a dressmaker in Crestfall who needed an assistant and that the work was respectable and the pay adequate. She touched Clara's hand with genuine, if misguided, affection, and said that coming to stay with her and Percival in town for the winter was not charity, but common sense. Clara thanked her and declined. Thomas, the last to speak, said, only standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, "Good luck, Clara." It was meant kindly. It landed like a small stone dropped from a height. She went to the ravine 3 days after the will reading on a morning when the sky was the color of old tin and the cold had a texture to it that she felt through her coat. Flint walked ahead of her on the path she had found on the map's exterior section, a deer trail that dropped east from the homestead claim angled north through a stand of stunted pine and then descended sharply into the cut where the ravine opened. The descent was steeper than she had anticipated, the path narrow enough that loose shale cascaded around her boots with each step, and twice she had to use her hands on the rock face to keep her balance. Flint navigated it without apparent concern, his paws finding the solid ground between the sliding stones with an instinct that made her briefly envious. The cave mouth was not dramatic. That surprised her. She had imagined something significant, a feature that would announce itself. Instead, it was a low horizontal opening in the rock face at the bottom of the ravine, wide enough to enter without ducking, but not by much, partially screened by a growth of low scrub that had established itself in the sheltered air of the ravine floor. She would have walked past it if the map had not placed her exactly here at this precise angle, in this exact spot where the shadow of the overhanging rock fell in a specific way that the map had marked with a small, careful cross. She lit the lantern she had carried in her pack and stepped through. The temperature change was immediate, not dramatic, not the blast of warmth one might imagine, but unmistakable. The way stepping from shadow into sun is unmistakable, even when neither is extreme. The air inside the cave was still and held a quality she had no word for, something between warmth and the memory of warmth, as though the rock itself had decided long ago to keep a different understanding of the season than the world above maintained. Flint stepped in beside her and did not hesitate, which she took as information. The first chamber was roughly the shape of a flattened oval, the ceiling high enough to stand straight in the center, but sloping toward the edges. The walls were pale gray limestone, threaded with darker mineral deposits that caught the lantern light in shifting blues, the colors of old bruises fading to something almost beautiful. The floor was uneven but navigable, and the air that moved through it, moving, she realized, not randomly but directionally drawn from somewhere deeper, carried a mineral scent, and beneath that faintly something organic, something alive. She followed the map through a low connecting passage that required her to tilt her head, and the second chamber opened before her with a scale that the map's careful notation had prepared her for, but that still, in the physical reality of standing inside it, registered as something larger than expectation. It was roughly the size of her father's barn, though the ceiling arched rather than rose in straight rafters, and the back wall curved away into shadow beyond what her lantern could reach. And there, occupying the center left portion of the chamber floor, was the pool. She had not let herself believe entirely until this moment. The water was still and perfectly clear, perhaps 10 feet across at its widest point, the floor of it visible in pale detail, smooth stone mineral deposits, a faint shimmer that was not the lantern's reflection, but something generated from below. She knelt at the edge and held her palm above the surface. The heat rose toward her hand before she made contact, not the dry heat of a stove or the conducted heat of a hot stone, but the specific living warmth of water that has traveled a great distance through rock and arrived at this surface still carrying the Earth's interior temperature. She pressed her palm to the water and felt it 53 degrees, she estimated, perhaps 54, stable, year-round, confirmed. Her father had known this for years. He had known it and had said nothing had allowed the family to understand the ravine claim as worthless, had let Robert take the railroad land, and Edith take the silver, and Thomas take the horse, and had put this map in an envelope that he pressed into the hands of the child who would look at it rather than sell it. She sat on her heels beside the pool and let that understanding settle fully into place. It was not sentimentality that her father had chosen her. It was assessment. He had watched his children for 30 years and made a judgment about which of them would follow a map into a cave in November and kneel in the dark and feel the temperature of water rather than calculating the price of it. But it was what she found on the east wall of the second chamber that changed everything from possibility into certainty. Her father had been here, not once, not twice, repeatedly over a period she estimated from what she found at more than 3 years. The evidence of his presence was methodical and layered wooden shelving attached to the rock face with iron brackets she recognized from the homestead workshop. 3 levels of planks holding ceramic containers of graduated sizes, each one labeled in Edmund's careful hand. Clay vessels lined along the base of the east wall, several of them filled with dark, loamy soil that she scooped into her palm and pressed between her fingers. Soil that had been worked, amended, improved. Richer than anything she had found in the homestead fields. A hoe and a spade, their handles worn to the particular smoothness that only comes from extended regular use, leaning against the wall beside a coil of rope and 2 folded pieces of canvas. And in the corner, where the cave wall met the floor in a natural seam, a wooden box the size of a small crate, reinforced at the corners with iron strapping, with a brass lock plate that the key from the envelope opened with a single clean turn. Inside a journal, leather covered thick with pages, the binding cracked with use. She opened it to the first page and read her father's entry dated 3 years before his death, written in ink that had been carefully stored. She could see the small bottle still half full nestled in the corner of the box beside 2 replacement nibs, and his handwriting. Here was firm and young-looking, the hand of a man with a project he believed in. Found the pool in March. Temperature consistent with what I suspected from the steam I observed last winter, rising from the ravine floor on cold mornings. The rock holds heat. The water moves. This is not an accident of geology. It is a system, and systems can be worked with. She turned pages. He had recorded everything. Temperature readings taken at the same time each day, notated in a column down the right margin of each entry. Experiments with soil composition. What he had brought in, what he had found naturally accumulating near the pool's edge, how he had combined them. First plantings, first failures, adjustments made with the systematic patience of a man who understood that learning something new required being wrong in informative ways before you could be right. He had killed 2 rounds of seedlings before understanding the humidity gradient in the chamber dryer near the entrance, increasingly moist toward the pool, and adjusting his layout accordingly. And then 18 months in the first success potatoes. Set eyes in the amended soil on the east side, 12 inches from the pool edge. Germination in 11 days. Growth rate exceeds anything I have seen in the homestead fields. The heat from below creates a growing season with no season. This is what I needed to know. Clara sat on the cave floor and read for 2 hours until the lantern began to dim. Flint lay nearby with his head resting on his forepaws, watching her with the calm attention of a mind who has decided this place is acceptable and this person is doing something important. The pool made no sound at all, and the temperature in the chamber held steady at 53 degrees while above them, the Wyoming wind moved over the ravine and found nothing to grip. She read about the hoe. He had brought it in pieces and assembled it inside because the passage was too narrow for a long-handled tool. She read about the canvas hung in sections to create thermal zones, directing the warmth from the pool into the growing area and away from the storage section where root vegetables needed slightly cooler conditions to hold. She read about the specific challenge of light, how Edmund had positioned the reflective surfaces, pieces of polished tin nailed at angles to the cave walls, to direct the indirect daylight from the cave entrance as far into the chamber as possible, and how he had supplemented this with lantern light on a rotation he had worked out to balance plant needs against fuel consumption. She read about his failures honestly recorded, a round of spinach that grew leggy and weak before he understood the light requirements, an onion crop that rotted because he had not yet solved the drainage problem in the clay-heavy soil near the chamber center, a near disaster in the second winter when the entrance partially collapsed in a freeze-thaw cycle And he had spent 3 days with a pick in near darkness restoring access. And she read the final pages, the entries from his last months written in a hand that was beginning to show the tremor of his illness, the letters wider spaced and less precisely formed, but still legible, still careful. He had been managing the cave alone through his illness, making the 8-mile journey from the homestead as often as he could, leaving gaps when he could not manage it, and returning to find the garden largely self-sustaining, the temperature holding the root vegetables maintaining their state in the clay vessels. His last entry in the journal was dated 6 weeks before his death, and it ended with a sentence that she read 3 times before she stood up. The next person who reads this will know more about what grows here than I do. That is the point of leaving a record, not to preserve the past, but to accelerate what comes after. She walked out of the cave into the failing afternoon with the journal under her arm and the key in her pocket, and the understanding that what she had just read was not a dying man's delusion. It was a 3-year research project conducted in secret by a man who had known exactly which of his children would use it well and had structured his entire final year around making sure it reached her hands and no one else's. Gustav Brenner's smithy occupied the south end of Crest Falls Main Street, a low building with a permanent haze of coal smoke above it and the particular warmth of a space where fire was always present. He was 53, broad and deliberate, with hands that looked as though they had been manufactured rather than grown. And he had a reputation in Crestfall for 2 things: excellent ironwork and an absolute disinclination to discuss other people's business. Claire had known him peripherally for years. He had repaired tools for the homestead, had helped with 2 fence projects. When Edmund needed extra hands, had attended the funeral with the respectful silence of a man who knew when words added nothing. She found him at his forge in the late afternoon, and she did not preamble. She showed him the map, laid it on the work table near the door, where the light was good, and watched his face. He looked at it for a long moment. Then, "Your father was a wise man. I knew him well." He straightened and looked at her directly. "He asked me to wait until you came to me. He said you would come." He went to a shelf above the door and brought down a small wrapped package cloth tied with cord the size of a large fist. Inside, seed packets carefully sealed with wax and a folded paper with Edmund's handwriting listing their contents and provenance. Cold, hardy potato varieties sourced from Appalachian seed savers who had maintained strains through hard northern winters for generations. A kale variety developed by New England farmers for growing under minimal light in root cellar conditions. A spinach strain that Edmund had cross-referenced with 3 agricultural journals to confirm its performance in low-light environments. He had ordered these through a seed merchant in Denver, paying for them the previous spring when he had already known he would not plant them himself. He had known. He had spent his final healthy months preparing for a future he would not see, packaging seeds for a grower he would not instruct in person, trusting that the journal would serve where he could not. Clara's jaw tightened with something she did not name out loud. She took the package and held it against the journal she was already carrying. Gustav was watching her with the patience of a man who has learned that silence is usually the right offer. Then, "He also told me about the ventilation." He paused. "The pipe system he built it handles 1 person working short periods. If you plan to stay through the winter—" He stopped. He had said enough. She looked at him. "What would it take to expand it?" "3 days of work, iron pipestone, anchors, mortar. Tools I have," he considered. "And the passage is narrow. The work would be tight." "Can you start this week?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Does Robert know about the cave?" The question landed with more weight than its 6 words suggested. She said no. Gustav picked up a length of iron rod from the workbench and turned it in his hands, not examining it, just having something to hold while he thought. "Better that way," he said. "Your father said something to me last spring. He said Robert had asked about the ravine once years ago, and your father had told him there was nothing there worth the trouble of looking." He set the rod down. "Your father said Robert believed him." or acted like he did. He met her eyes. Your father wasn't sure which. She walked home in the dark, and Flint kept pace at her heel, and the wind had a new edge to it that was not just cold but purposeful, the way the air moves before a serious winter asserts itself. She did not allow herself the luxury of the fear she could feel at the edges of her thinking, the fear that she was wrong, that the journal was wishful, and the cave was not what it appeared, that she would commit herself to something the Wyoming winter would simply dismantle. She allowed herself instead the specific practical comfort of a list: what the cave required, what she could provide, what Gustav would contribute, and what she would need to work out on her own. She had the seeds. She had the journal. She had the map and the key and the tool of knowing which was the most valuable thing her father had left her. Not the cave itself, not the pool, but 28 years of watching him do the thing that almost no one did, which was to look at a problem the world had decided was not worth solving and ask whether the world had looked carefully enough. Over the 2 weeks that followed, Clara and Gustav worked the ventilation system in the cave with the focused efficiency of people who understand that weather is not a flexible variable. Gustav's pipework was clean and tight, anchored into the natural fissure in the ceiling, with stone and mortar collars he fabricated at the smithy and carried down in sections. And when they completed the final connection and tested the draw by holding a candle near the entrance passage, the flame bent steadily inward and upward in exactly the pattern that indicated proper airflow through a sealed system. He said nothing about the garden. He saw the soil, the shelving, Edmund's organized evidence of 3 years of work, and he noted it the way a craftsman notes good work in another trade, with a nod and a return to his own task. Flint had, by the end of the first week, established a preferred position near the east wall of the second chamber, a slight depression in the stone floor that was warmer than the surrounding surface, which confirmed what Edmund's temperature readings had suggested, that the thermal gradient was not uniform, but concentrated with hot spots that a careful observer could map and use. Clara began to understand her father's journal not as a record of what the cave was, but as a set of instructions for how to see it. And the difference between those two things was she was beginning to understand the difference between inheritance and education. On the last day of their work, as she and Gustav climbed the ravine path in the early dark, the first serious snow of the season began. Not the preliminary dusting that had come and gone through October, but the deliberate snow of a winter that has decided to begin. It fell straight down in the windless cold, large flakes that accumulated without drama on the scrubland, in the stone and the path they were walking, covering their footprints almost as fast as they made them. Gustav stopped at the top of the ravine and looked back at the cave entrance below, already half obscured by the failing light and the white accumulation. Your father worked for 3 winters without telling anyone. He did not make it a question. He told me, at the end. Yes, Gustav pulled his collar up. He waited until he was sure. He looked at her then briefly with an expression that held something more than the practical regard of a man who has completed a job. He was sure. She watched him walk toward the settlement trail, and then she looked down at the cave entrance one more time, barely visible, now a shadow in the rock face that the snow was already beginning to soften into the surrounding landscape. Below that rock, the temperature was 53 degrees. The soil her father had built over 3 years was waiting. The seeds from Denver were in her pack. Flint stood at her left heel and looked up at her with the calm, uncomplicated loyalty of a creature that has decided where it belongs. Above them, the snow fell in the particular silence of a winter that has made up its mind. She went down. She built the life of the cave the way her father had built his journal, methodically, without sentiment, with the understanding that every decision made in the first weeks would compound into either competence or catastrophe by February. The frame bed went into the southeast corner of the second chamber, where the thermal gradient was highest, and the airflow from the new ventilation system created a steady, breathable current without drafts. She packed the space beneath the bed frame with flat stones, understanding from Edmund's notes that ground contact in a cave environment conducted cold upward even when the ambient temperature was stable, and she layered the surface with the furs she had spent the previous summer preserving 2 elk hides. One bare the cured skins of smaller animals that she had trapped and processed on the homestead, with the quiet, practical efficiency of a woman who had never confused sentiment with wastefulness. The lanterns went on iron brackets Gustav had fabricated in the weeks before the snow deepened enough to make the ravine path treacherous. 5 of them positioned along the chamber walls and passage ceiling at the angles Edmund's reflective tin system required their collective light, creating something that was not daylight, but was enough in the particular way that enough is sometimes its own form of abundance. She had purchased oil enough for 4 months from the merchant in Crestfall, loading it down the ravine path in 2-gallon tins before the serious accumulation began. The cans, heavy enough that Flint had watched her carry them with an expression of focused concern. She planted the first round within 3 days of establishing the sleeping arrangements, working by lantern light in the hours before dawn when the cave was at its quietest and the temperature of the pool ran closest to its upper range. The Appalachian potato sets went into the east side soil, first pressed into the amended earth her father had built up over 3 years, a medium so different from the homestead's rocky clay that the difference registered in her hands as almost biological, like the distinction between dead wood and living. She spaced the sets at 14 inches, 3 inches deep, in rows that followed the curve of the chamber wall, understanding from Edmund's notes that the thermal gradient decreased moving away from the pool, and that the layout should account for this differential rather than fight it. The kale and spinach went into the shallower beds closer to the entrance passage, where the airflow was stronger, and the light from the entrance, even reduced by winter, reached further than it did in the chamber's interior. She watered everything from the pool itself using a bucket she lowered on a cord to avoid disturbing the surface. More than necessary, the water arriving in the containers at 53 degrees and warming the soil from below as it dispersed through the root zone in a slow, even percolation that she traced with her fingers in the days that followed, learning by touch what the roots were experiencing. The first week passed in a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like craft tending, observing, recording in the journal she had started on the back pages of Edmund's, continuing his notation system because it was already calibrated to this specific environment, and beginning again from scratch would have wasted information. She recorded temperatures twice daily. She recorded the growth rates of every planted variety. She sketched the layout of each bed with measurements and orientation notes, understanding that the map she was building was for no one yet, but that knowledge recorded was knowledge that could survive her the way Edmund's journal had survived him. On the 8th day, she found the rot. She had gone to check the clay storage vessels that Edmund had stocked in his final visit to the cave potatoes he had harvested and stored against the possibility that his successor would need an existing food supply rather than having to wait for a first harvest. There were 14 vessels, each containing between 8 and 12 potatoes nested in dry sand. She lifted the lid of the 4th vessel from the left, and the smell reached her before the sight did the specific sweet rot smell of the mold that attacks potato flesh in conditions of excessive humidity. When she lifted the vessel's contents into the lantern light, the damage was clear. All 12 potatoes in that vessel were compromised, and when she checked the surrounding 3 vessels, she found the same progression in 2 of them. She sat back on her heels and did the arithmetic without allowing herself to avoid it. She had lost 34 potatoes from the stored supply, nearly a third of what Edmund had left. The fresh plantings were intact, the sets she had pressed into the amended soil 8 days ago, showing no sign of the fungal pressure that had attacked the stored stock, but those would not be ready for harvest for weeks yet, and the calendar was December, and the snow above was deepening by increments. She could feel in the weight of the silence the cave produced when the wind changed direction. The mathematics of what she had lost pressed against the mathematics of what she needed, and the answer was a number she did not like. Edmund's journal had a passage about humidity management that she had read but not fully absorbed on her first pass, and she went back to it now, with the specific attention of someone who has learned that her father's apparently academic observations were operational instructions in disguise. He had identified the humidity gradient in the cave as its most critical variable, not the temperature, which was stable by nature, but the moisture content of the air, which varied with season and weather patterns in ways that were not obvious because they were not visible. The humidity concentration near the cave entrance shifted when exterior temperatures dropped rapidly, pulling moist air from the interior toward the entrance in a pattern that created localized high humidity pockets in the storage area. Edmund had addressed this in his third year by adding sand layers to his clay vessels. The sand he had used was still on the east wall shelf, 2 full sacks of coarse creek sand he had carried down before the freeze. She rebuilt the storage system in one long session, working through what she estimated was the middle of the night without stopping, removing every potato from every vessel, discarding the damaged ones, and inspecting the sound ones under close lantern light, then re-nesting the good stock in fresh sand with a thicker drainage layer at the vessel base. She added a layer of dry moss, the same moss that grew near the pool's edge, harvested and spread to dry on the shelf over the top of each vessel's contents, which Edmund had noted in a late entry as creating a breathable seal that moderated humidity fluctuation without blocking airflow entirely. When she was done, she sat on the cave floor in the lantern light with her hands resting on her knees, the discarded potatoes piled in a basin to her left, and she felt the things she had been holding at the edges of her awareness since the moment she had opened that fourth vessel. It was not despair. Despair requires the belief that nothing can be recovered. What she felt was closer to the specific loneliness of a person who has made a large decision in private and now faces its first serious consequence with no one to consult and no mechanism for retreat. She had left the homestead. She had declined Edith's offer and Robert's money and Thomas's well-meaning nothing. She was here in a cave in December with a third of her stored food supply, rotting in a basin in the surface of the world 40 feet above her, locked under snow, that was not going to stop being snow because she required it to. Flint crossed the chamber and settled beside her, his warm weight pressing against her leg, steady and unhurried. She put her hand on his back and sat there for a while in the specific warmth of the cave, which did not waver and did not negotiate and did not care what she was feeling. And that steadiness, the absolute impartiality of geological heat, was, she realized, the thing her father had understood and tried to tell her at the end. The earth did not offer comfort. It offered consistency. And consistency in a winter like this one was worth more than comfort had ever been. She replanted the following morning, not as replacement for what she had lost. The timing was wrong for that, the growing season inside the cave, operating on its own calendar, that she was still learning to read, but as an extension of the existing layout using the remaining Appalachian sets and the last of the kale seed to fill 3 new shallow beds. She cut into the amended soil near the pool's northwest edge, where the thermal output was strongest. As she worked the soil, pressing each set into the earth with the specific care of a person who understands that this action has consequences that extend weeks forward, she noticed something Edmund's journal had not mentioned. The germination rate of the sets she had planted 8 days ago was already visible. Small white nodes pushing through the soil surface, not yet leaves, but the preliminary architecture of leaves, the plant's first declaration of intention. In conditions outside this cave in December in Wyoming territory, nothing germinated. The ground was iron. Seeds were dormant cargo waiting for April. Here in the 53-degree consistency of geothermal heat, with amended soil and water drawn from the pool, the potato sets had germinated in 8 days. The eyes breaking dormancy and reaching upward the way living things do when the conditions they require are finally and probably present. She measured the nodes. She recorded the measurement. She calculated based on Edmund's growth rate notations when she could expect the first harvestable yield from this planting. The number she arrived at working forward from germination through the stages Edmund had documented was 41 days. 41 days to harvest from the amended east side beds, with a second round already established in the northwest beds that would follow by 2 weeks. The rotted storage loss was real, and the mathematics of it were real, but the cave's capacity to generate new food was also real, and more importantly, it was faster than she had assumed before this morning. She wrote the revised projection in the journal with the steadiness of someone who has moved from fear back into calculation. The two states were not opposites. They were sequential. Fear was what told you the problem was real, and calculation was what you did once you had listened to that information. The storm came on December 14th, and it came as storms in that part of Wyoming came when they meant it, not gradually, not with the courtesy of preliminary warning that gave people time to arrange themselves, but with the abruptness of a decision already made. The morning had been gray and windless, the air so cold and still that sound carried in strange ways the distant movement of cattle on someone's far claim, reaching the ravine in fragments. By midday, the wind had begun, not building up from a breeze, but arriving at full force. And by late afternoon, the snow was falling so densely that it had texture, not weather so much as material, something that pressed against the ravine walls and accumulated in the entrance passage and reduced the world to a radius of 3 feet around any lantern. Clara had seen the change in the air the previous evening and had made 2 trips up the ravine path before dawn, the last load she could manage before the passage became impassable, carrying additional oil-dried beans she had stored at the homestead and the last of the good salt pork wrapped in cloth. When the storm arrived at full force, she was already inside the entrance passage, packed with the small supply of cut wood she had stored against the cave wall, and the entry to the second chamber, covered with the canvas curtain she had rigged on a rope and pulley system that Edmund's notes had suggested and that Gustav had fabricated in iron. The snow built against the cave entrance over 2 days. She could hear it, or rather, she could hear the gradual disappearance of the sound she had been hearing. The wind first muffled and then silenced as the accumulation rose past the entrance until the cave existed in a quiet so complete that it had a physical quality, a presence rather than an absence. The temperature in the second chamber did not change. The pool did not change. The plants did not change. Above her, she knew the world was being reorganized by cold in ways that would require weeks to understand, but that reorganization had no access to where she was. And the knowledge of this was not triumphant. It was simply structural. The way understanding that a roof holds is structural. You don't celebrate it. You build under it. Flint adapted to the confinement without complaint, his energy channeled into a more attentive version of his usual watchfulness, patrolling the perimeter of the second chamber at regular intervals, as though auditing the cave's contents. On the 4th day of the complete blockage, he stationed himself directly below the ventilation pipe and looked up at it for a long time, which she understood as a report rather than a request. The pipe was holding. The airflow was correct. He was confirming what her instruments could not. On the 6th day, working in the garden by the steady light of 3 lanterns, she found the final pages of Edmund's journal, the pages she had not reached on her first reading, because the lantern had dimmed and she had returned the book to the box without completing it. She read them now at the east wall shelf, where the light was best, the cave quiet around her. The handwriting on these pages was different from the body of the journal, smaller, closer together, the pen pressing less firmly into the paper, as though the writer had been conserving effort or writing in poor light or both. Edmund had written these final entries in what she calculated from the date notations as the last 2 months before his death. The content was different too. He had stopped recording temperatures and germination rates. What he wrote instead was closer to what she could only call reckoning, a private accounting of what he had done and why and what he believed it would come to. He had written about Robert's question. The entry was dated 18 months before his death, a full year before she had known anything about the cave's contents. Robert came to the ravine site today. He rode the perimeter of the claim and asked me directly what the cave contained. I told him it was a geological feature, cold and unremarkable. He looked at me for a moment in that way he has the way of calculating whether what he is being told is worth investigating further. I believe he decided it was not worth his time. I'm not certain he was being fully honest with me, and I was not being honest with him, And we both understood this, and we left each other alone about it. This is how Robert and I have managed each other for 30 years. The next entry a week later, I have been thinking about what it means to give someone something they do not yet know they need. Robert needs money and leverage and the appearance of success. I have given him that. He will use it well by his own measure. Edith needs stability in a form of usefulness that the world will recognize as such. I have given her that. Thomas needs time, which is the one thing I cannot give him, and the one thing only failure will eventually supply. But Clara needs a problem large enough to be worth her attention. I have been watching her for 28 years, and that is what I see, a mind that goes quiet and goes to work when the problem is serious, and that has never yet been given a problem serious enough. The cave is serious enough. She put the journal down and stood in the cave in the unchanging warmth and understood something about her father she had not fully assembled before. He had not chosen her out of sentiment, and he had not chosen her out of pity, and he had not chosen her because she was the easiest or the kindest or the most deserving. He had chosen her the way a craftsman chooses a specific tool for a specific task, not with affection, though the affection was real, but with the judgment of a man who has studied the problem and identified the solution. The cave required someone who would not sell it, who would not exploit it carelessly, who would spend the time in the dark to understand it before deciding what it was for. He had looked at his 4 children, and he had known. She did not know how long the storm lasted in calendar terms because the cave had its own calendar marked in plant growth and lantern cycles and the depth of sleep, and the external timeline became theoretical rather than practical. She estimated from the number of lantern fills she had developed a precise system knowing exactly how many hours each fill, provided that the complete blockage lasted 9 days before the drift above the entrance settled enough that she could push through it with the iron bars she had kept specifically for this purpose. The bar had been Edmund's found in the tool cache on the east wall. He had kept it there for the same reason. The world above the ravine was unrecognizable. The scrub land had disappeared into a white geometry that simplified the landscape into shapes without detail, every feature buried or smoothed or erased. The cold was a different order of magnitude from the cold before the storm, not sharper exactly, but more complete, the way silence is different from quietness. She stood at the ravine's top edge and looked toward Crestfall, 7 miles northeast along a trail that no longer existed as a trail, and the absence of smoke above the settlement's tree line, normally visible on clear days, told her something she needed several minutes to interpret. Not that there was no fire, that there was less fire than there should have been. She went back down and harvested what the cave could give her that day. The east side potatoes were 2 weeks from full maturity, but the northwest beds she had planted later had a different variety that matured faster in the cave's conditions, and she was able to pull 14 potatoes of good size from the northwest section without damaging the remaining plants. The kale and spinach had been producing continuously since the 3rd week, and she cut the outer leaves in the rotation Edmund had documented, always the outer, always leaving the growing center, and filled 2 baskets. The stored onions and carrots from Edmund's final pre-illness harvest were intact in their vessels, the improved sand layer storage holding correctly. She counted and sorted and packed with the efficiency of someone who has stopped measuring abundance and started measuring function. Gustav found her 2 days later. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of someone on the ravine path, the specific rhythm of a large man's careful steps on ice stone, and she was at the cave entrance when he reached the bottom, his face red from the cold, pulling a small wooden sledge behind him. His expression when he saw her was the expression of a man who has prepared himself for one outcome and received another. "I knew you were alive," his voice carrying the controlled relief of someone who had said that sentence to himself many times in the preceding weeks to keep it true. "I told them you were alive." She stepped out of the cave entrance into the cold. "Who is them?" He told her. The summary was efficient and factual and terrible. The storm had driven the settlement's reserves to critical levels faster than anyone had projected. Dr. Merritt had instituted emergency rationing by the end of the second week. The hard biscuit and salt pork that represented the majority of the remaining food supply was producing the symptoms that a man of medicine recognized in a settlement of frontier people experienced simply as a slow, grinding diminishment gums that bled, energy that did not return after sleep, a particular paleness in the faces of children that was not the pallor of cold, but of bodies consuming themselves. A child in the Hendricks family had died. An old man named Pruitt had become confused and then delirious and was being cared for in the church, which had become a combination infirmary and rationing station. Robert and Edith were managing on their stored provisions, which were better than most, but even they were rationing. The discussion at the last community meeting, Gustav said, had included the phrase spring abandonment, the possibility of leaving Crestfall entirely when the thaw allowed travel, conceding the settlement to the winter that had beaten it. Clara listened to all of this without expression. The instinct she registered was not pity and not vindication. Those were both luxuries that required a person to be standing at a distance from the problem. What she registered was the same quality of focused attention she had felt on the morning of the mold, the switching over from feeling to function that her father had apparently observed in her from childhood and considered a specific form of intelligence. How many families? She was already turning back toward the cave entrance. 41 people counting children, 7 households. Give me until morning. Come back with whatever you can pull on that sledge. He came back with 3 men from the settlement and 2 additional sledges, and they spent the day in a relay operation that Clara directed from the cave with the precision of someone who has been running a logistics system in her head for weeks and is now simply externalizing it. The potatoes, first the mature harvest from the east side beds, lifted carefully to leave the root systems intact for regrowth, brushed and packed in cloth. Then the cut greens wrapped tightly to prevent freezing during transport, packed in the center of each sledge load, where the body heat of the pullers would help maintain temperature. The stored onions and carrots from Edmund's vessels, the braided herbs from the drying shelf, 2 baskets of stored spinach that had been growing continuously for 6 weeks and was now so dense in the harvesting beds that cutting it back was as much maintenance as harvest. The men from the settlement said almost nothing. They were not men from whom conversation came easily under normal conditions, and these were not normal conditions. And when they carried baskets of living green vegetables out of a cave in a Wyoming winter, they existed in the particular silence of people experiencing something that is not available in their existing vocabulary for what the world is and how it works. One of them, a young man, 19 or 20, with frostbitten ears and the careful movements of someone whose energy is already rationed, held a bunch of kale up to the cave lantern light and looked at it for a long moment and then put it in the transport basket with a gentleness that had nothing to do with the practical value of the vegetable. The relay to Crestfall took 2 days. The trail they broke through the snow became a track, and the track became a passage, and by the time they arrived at the settlement's edge on the second afternoon word had preceded them, Gustav had sent a man ahead on snowshoes the night before, and people emerged from their houses into the cold with the specific quality of movement that Clara would later in her journal describe simply as not like people receiving supplies, like people remembering what it felt like to be all right. Robert was standing at the edge of the group that gathered around the sledges. She saw him before he saw her. His height made him visible over the crowd, and she watched his face in the moment he registered what the sledges contained. The calculation she had expected to see there, the rapid assessment of quantity and implication and value, was not what she saw. What she saw instead was a man whose face had been rearranged by something he had not planned for. He stood very still in the cold while around him, people reached for bundles of vegetables with the careful reverence of the hungry, and he was still standing that way when Clara came even with him pushing the last sledge. His jaw moved once before anything came out. How much is left down there? The question landed on her like a weight she had been expecting. Not are you all right, not I didn't think it was possible. The first thing Robert Hale found to say to his sister after she had appeared from a cave with enough food to prevent his community from considering abandonment was a question about inventory. She looked at him steadily. Enough for the people who need it. She pushed the sledge forward and did not stop. Dr. Merritt met her at the church steps with the controlled urgency of a man who has been managing a deteriorating situation and has just received an unexpected resource. He took her through the current cases, the scurvy presentations, the malnutrition, complicated pneumonia risk, the specific nutritional deficits he had been unable to address with what the settlement had available. He spoke quickly and precisely the vocabulary of a medical man who has stopped softening information for non-medical people because the situation no longer permits that courtesy. She listened with the same quality of attention she brought to Edmund's journal, complete, unhurried filing each detail in the specific place where it connected to something she already knew. The kale and spinach for the vitamin deficiency, the potatoes for caloric density, the onions for the sulfur compounds that supported immune function in ways she had read about in one of the agricultural journals Edmund had stored in the cave. She told Dr. Merritt which vegetables to prioritize for which presentations, and he looked at her across the church threshold with an expression she recognized as the expression of a man revising a prior judgment, which was, she thought, one of the most useful things a person could do with their face. "Your father," he began, and then stopped. "He left good records," she said. That night in the loft of the church where Gustav had arranged a sleeping space, she lay awake and read the final entry in Edmund's journal by the light of a single candle. He had written it in the smallest hand she had ever seen from him, cramped at the bottom of the last page, as though he had not known until that moment that he needed to say it and had found only the space remaining. "I spent 20 years building things that the land and the weather could take. I spent the last 3 building something neither of them can reach. That is the only kind of building that matters in the end, the kind that goes deep enough." The candle guttered in a draft from the church's imperfect walls. Outside, the temperature was falling again, the thermometer above the church door that Dr. Merritt checked twice daily having dropped to levels that the instrument's manufacturer had not anticipated needing to mark. Snow was beginning again, soft and deliberate. In the ravine 7 miles southwest in the unchanging dark, the pool maintained its temperature and the plants continued their necessary work. And Flint was doing what he always did in her absence, waiting at the warm depression near the east wall with the particular patience of a creature that understands the difference between being left and being trusted. The distribution system that Dr. Merritt established in the days following Clara's first delivery was the kind of thing that reveals a community's character by the way it handles scarcity, who defers, who insists, who counts carefully, and who pretends not to. He prioritized without sentiment children first, then the elderly, then the adults, showing clinical deficiency symptoms, then the able-bodied who were hungry but not yet compromised. He kept records in his medical ledger, tracking intake against symptom progression with the methodical attention of a man who had decided that if he was going to be responsible for these people's survival, he was going to be responsible for it completely, not approximately. Clara watched the distribution from the edge of the church steps on the second morning and understood that what she was seeing was not charity. Charity was when you gave from surplus. What she had brought was structural. It changed the equation of what was possible in Crestfall between now and the thaw, and that was a different category of thing entirely. She was not a benefactor. She was a variable that had entered a broken system and altered its trajectory. The distinction mattered to her in ways she did not try to explain to anyone, because explaining it would have required claiming a kind of intentionality she was not sure she had possessed when she first descended into the ravine 2 months ago. She had not set out to save anyone. She had set out to understand what her father had built. The work of returning to the Barrive and maintaining the supply relay occupied the first 2 weeks of February with a physical intensity that left little room for anything except the next task. Thomas arrived on the 4th day driving the horse and wagon along the broken trail that the relay teams had now packed firm enough to support wheels, and he did not announce himself or explain his presence. He simply pulled up to the ravine, had tied the horse to the iron stake Gustav had driven into the frozen ground on his third trip, and began carrying baskets. He had brought the horse's feed packed in the wagon bed enough for 2 weeks, which meant he had thought about the logistics before he came, had calculated what staying would require, rather than simply showing up and expecting the situation to accommodate him. She let him work without comment. He had not brought explanation or apology with him, and she did not require either. What she observed over those first days was that Thomas worked with his whole attention, the way people work when they are trying to outpace something internal. He asked questions about the cave, not about its value or its history, but operational questions, the questions of someone trying to understand a system well enough to help maintain it. Why were the beds arranged at this distance from the pool? What determined the harvest rotation? How had she solved the drainage problem in the northwest section? His questions were good questions, which surprised her less than it might have, because Thomas had always been intelligent. The waste had always been in the application, not the capacity. On the third day, without preamble, as they were working side by side on the expanded northwest beds, "The horse is yours to use as long as you need for the hauling." He did not look at her while he said it, his hands continuing to work the soil. "I used what father left me badly, I know that." He paused. "I can't undo the using, but I can do something about the badly." She handed him a row marker without responding, and he understood that the response was the continuation of the work, and they continued. Edith came on a Thursday alone without Percival. She had walked the 7 miles from Crestfall to the ravine head in boots that were good for town and inadequate for packed snow, and she arrived with wet feet and an expression Clara had never seen on her sister's face. Not the managed brightness Edith typically deployed as social armor, not the false sympathy she had offered at the will reading, but something stripped and undefended, the face of a woman who has been alone with herself long enough that the performance has become too expensive to maintain. She stood at the bottom of the ravine and looked at the cave entrance for a long moment before going in. When she stepped through and the warmth of the second chamber reached her, she stopped completely and stood still in a way that reminded Clara unexpectedly of the young man from the settlement who had held the kale up to the lantern light. The stillness of someone receiving information they had not known they were missing. She moved through this chamber, slowly looking at the pool, at the garden beds, at Edmund's shelving on the east wall, with Clara's additions above it at Flint, in his warm depression, near the wall at the lanterns, in the ventilation pipe, in the canvas curtain, and the hand-drawn map tacked to the rock face beside the entrance to the passage. She did not touch anything. She looked at everything the way a person looks at something they have caused damage to and cannot repair. Her voice, when she found it, had none of its usual precision. "I didn't know he was doing this." She meant Edmund. "None of us knew." He made sure of that. Clara was trimming the outer kale leaves in the harvest rotation, her hands continuing the familiar motion. He needed time to know if it would work before anyone else's judgment entered the equation. Edith looked at her. He needed time away from Robert's judgment. From all of it, Clara straightened. He'd spent 20 years building things that other people's opinions shaped. He wanted to build one thing that was just true before anyone had a chance to tell him it wasn't. The silence between them had a different quality from the silences they had shared in childhood, or at the will reading those silences had been full of the things they weren't saying. This one was full of things that had already been said by events rather than words, and that therefore didn't need to be said again. Edith sat down on the low stone bench along the west wall, a bench Thomas had constructed from flat stones and a plank, and looked at her hands in her lap. "I told you to come and learn to sew." Her voice carried the specific weight of a person examining their own past behavior without the comfort of a good explanation for it. "I thought I was being practical." "You were being practical by your own information." Clara moved to the next row. "You didn't have the map." "No." Edith was quiet for a moment. "But I also didn't ask." She looked up. "You asked. You always asked him things. The rest of us talked at him, and you asked him things, and I told myself that was because you didn't have anything more interesting to do." Her jaw tightened slightly. That was not an honest account of the difference between us. What Edith said next was the thing that Clara would record in her journal that evening, not because it was the most dramatic moment of the winter, but because it was the most costly thing she had witnessed anyone in her family produce. Can you teach me what you know about this? Not the plant specifically, I mean, the way you look at something everyone else has written off and find the question in it instead of the conclusion. Her voice did not apologize for the request. It simply made it plainly, which was its own form of courage from a woman who had spent 31 years curating the appearance of already knowing what she needed to know. Clara looked at her sister across the cave, across the warmth and the growing things and the steady light, and gave her the answer that was true. Father taught me. I just didn't get in the way of what he was teaching. She brought Edith back 3 times that week, showing her the notation system, the temperature management, the harvest rotation logic, the relationship between the pool's output and the soil composition that Edmund had spent 3 years calibrating. Edith was a quick study in the specific way of people who have been intelligent all their lives, but have been applying that intelligence to managing surfaces rather than understanding systems. When she understood something, she understood it completely and immediately began connecting it to adjacent things, asking questions that anticipated the next layer rather than consolidating the current one. Clara recognized this as her sister's actual mind operating unmediated by the social calculations that usually ran in front of it, and found it considerably more interesting than the Edith she had known in 28 years of proximity. Dr. Merritt came to the cave formally on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of February by appointment with his medical bag and his ledger, in the specific bearing of a man who has decided to take something seriously that he did not previously take seriously and intends to do this without excessive self-flagellation about the prior position. He had sent a note through Gustav Miss Hale would like to examine the growing conditions with the aim of understanding the nutritional applications. I believe what you have done here has medical implications I have not yet fully documented. I would be grateful for access at your convenience. The formal note had made her smile briefly in the cave's privacy, the note of a man recalibrating rather than the note of a man apologizing. She had written back Thursday morning, come at first light. He spent 4 hours in the cave asking questions she answered with Edmund's journal open beside her so that she could attribute the original observations correctly. He was particularly interested in the continuous harvest capacity, the idea that the cave could produce fresh vegetables without seasonal interruption, and its implications for scurvy prevention, which he explained to her in clinical detail. She found genuinely interesting the mechanism by which vitamin deficiency accumulated and reversed the specific rate at which fresh produce could correct what weeks of inadequate diet had damaged. He had been treating scurvy for 6 weeks with the crude tools available to a frontier doctor. What she had brought him was the actual treatment, not a palliative. Near the end of his visit, standing at the edge of the pool with his ledger open and his pen moving, your father identified this and kept it private for 3 years. It was not quite a question. He was building it into something worth identifying. Clara was at the east side beds checking root development. A hole in the ground with warm water in it is a geological curiosity. A hole in the ground with warm water and 18 months of soil amendment in a documented growing record is a system that can be replicated. Dr. Merritt's pen stopped. He was documenting it for replication. He was documenting it for whoever came next. She looked up. He didn't know if that would be me. He was documenting it for whoever was willing to read carefully. He wrote something in his ledger that took longer than a single note. She didn't ask what it was. 3 weeks later, the letter he sent to the Wyoming Territorial Medical and Agricultural Journal was 11 pages long, and it opened with a sentence that Gustav read aloud to her from the published copy when it arrived in Crestfall 4 months later. What Edmund Hale built in the winter of 1883 and what his daughter Clara Hale seen from Clara Hale sustained through the winter of 1886 represents not merely an agricultural achievement, but a demonstration of what becomes possible when knowledge is treated as a system rather than a secret. Robert came to the cave alone on a Saturday in late February in the mid-morning, when the light was at its best angle in the ravine and the ice on the path had softened enough to be navigable without risk. She heard him on the path. His footsteps had a particular weight and deliberateness she had known since childhood, and she was at the entrance when he reached the bottom, which meant she saw his face in the moment before he had composed it for an audience, when it was still doing what faces do when they are alone with a hard thing. He looked older than he had at the will reading, not in the way of aging so much as in the way of a man who has been carrying something heavy for long enough that it has changed his posture. He was still the largest person in any room he entered, still had the bearing of someone accustomed to being deferred to, but there was a tightness around his eyes that she did not remember from before, and that she recognized was something that was not satisfaction, as the physical record of a winter spent knowing something was wrong and not having the vocabulary to address it. He stepped into the second chamber and looked at the pool, at the beds, at the shelving, with Edmund's original ceramic vessels alongside Clara's newer additions. A long silence opened between them, not the calculating silence he used as a business tool, but something different, the silence of a man encountering the full scale of what he had dismissed. How much did he put into this? Not dollars. He meant time and effort and intention. 3 years, at least 2 visits a month when his health allowed, more in the growing seasons. She moved to the work table along the east wall where she had been sorting seeds for the spring extension planting. He maintained it through the first winter of his illness without telling anyone. Robert's jaw worked the way it did when he was constructing a sentence that was harder to build than the sentences he was accustomed to. He knew I would have sold it. He knew you would have sold it within a year. She said this without judgment. It was simply what both of them knew to be true, and the truth of it had already done its work, and repeating it with an edge would have been addition without necessity. He knew Thomas would have let someone else manage it into nothing. He knew Edith would have converted it into something respectable and static. She set down the seeds. He knew I would leave it in the dark long enough to find out what it actually was. Robert looked at her, then directly with an expression she had never seen from him in any of their combined years. Not the elder brother authority, not the businessman's appraisal, not the thin-smiled dismissal of the will reading. What she saw was a man looking at his sibling without the intermediary of his own self-interest, possibly for the first time. He was right about all of us. He spent 30 years watching us. He earned the right to be right. The silence that followed was the most honest exchange they had produced in years of being family to each other. He didn't apologize. She didn't ask him to. There was a kind of integrity in his refusal to perform contrition he hadn't fully arrived at, and she respected it more than she would have respected a facile reconciliation that papered over the actual distance between them. What he said instead, after the long pause, was, "The path down the ravine is dangerous in the ice. People are going to need to use it regularly." He looked at the entrance passage, assessing the angle, the loose material, the way the meltwater ran. "I'll have it addressed before spring. Stone steps, rope, handholds on the east face. I know a man who does the work correctly." It was what Robert Hale offered instead of sorry. It was, she thought, the most useful form of the thing. The community's relationship to the cave shifted in March as the worst of the winter began its slow, grudging retreat, and people had enough margin of survival to think about something beyond the next week. The relay system Thomas maintained with the horse became a regular schedule rather than an emergency operation. Gustav built a proper loading platform at the ravine, head timber and iron, that allowed the wagon to be loaded directly from the baskets rather than by hand transfer, reducing the time each delivery required by half. Edith organized a preservation operation in a converted outbuilding near the church, drying, salting, storing in ways Clara had taught her that extended the reach of each harvest beyond the immediately perishable. Dr. Merritt's documentation of the nutritional outcomes was methodical and, for a frontier medical practice, unusually rigorous. He tracked the recovery rates of the scurvy cases against the introduction of fresh produce from the cave, correlating symptom improvement with the specific vegetables available each week. He noted that the spinach and kale produced superior results in the early stages of deficiency correction, while the potatoes provided the caloric foundation that allowed the body to prioritize healing rather than survival. He sent these observations to two colleagues in eastern cities, one in Philadelphia, one in Boston, who wrote back with questions that surprised him with their specificity and that he forwarded to Clara with a note. These men want to know things I do not yet know. I suspect you do. She answered the questions in letters she drafted in the cave by lantern light, pulling from Edmund's journal and her own two-volume record, and Dr. Merritt transcribed them into the correct medical and agricultural language and sent them east under both their names. The letter from the University of Missouri arrived 6 weeks later, addressed to Dr. Merritt, but containing in its second paragraph a specific request for correspondence directly with Miss Clara Hale, whose observations about soil thermal management and continuous harvest rotation the letter writer described as representing a significant practical contribution to the developing literature on controlled environment agriculture. Professor Elias Ward arrived in Crestfall on a Tuesday in early May, traveling on the same railroad that had made Robert's land valuable, carrying 3 leather satchels of notebooks in the focused, slightly abstracted manner of an academic who has been corresponding about something for months and has finally persuaded himself that it warrants the inconvenience of leaving his office. He was 46, lean and deliberate, with the kind of attentive eyes that missed very little and noted everything they caught without immediately declaring the notation. He introduced himself to Clara at the church where Dr. Merritt had arranged a meeting, and the first thing he said after the formal introduction was, "I've read your father's notes as you summarize them in your letters." He was working from first principles without access to the relevant literature. In 2 instances, he arrived at conclusions the literature reached years later by a different route. That's not common. She looked at him steadily. He had more time in the cave and less time in libraries. The trade seems to have worked. Ward spent a week. He was in the cave every day from first light, taking temperature measurements, sketching the layout, examining the soil composition with the tools he had brought in his satchels, asking questions that were always precise and sometimes unexpected. The questions of someone who had a framework and was testing where the evidence fit and where it exceeded the framework. He was respectful of the space in the way of a visitor who understands he is on someone else's ground, and he did not offer unsolicited assessments, which she appreciated. On his 5th day, crouched at the pool's edge with a thermometer. The pool output increases in December. He had found this in the temperature records. You noted it in your journal. Have you developed a hypothesis? The geothermal cycle responds to surface conditions in ways that aren't yet fully documented, she said. When the surface temperature drops rapidly, the pressure differential changes. The water moves differently. I think the heat output increases because the system is compensating, but I don't have the geology to confirm it. He looked up from the thermometer. I do. I'll confirm it. He stood. And I'd like to include that finding in the paper that I'm writing. With your name on it, your data, your observation, your hypothesis. He paused. The convention is co-authorship. She had thought about this before he asked it, had anticipated the question during his first day in the cave, had sat with it in the evenings, and worked out what she actually wanted. The paper should go out with your name. The knowledge will travel further with a university affiliation than with my name alone, and I want the knowledge to travel. She moved to the kale beds, continuing the harvest rotation while they talked. Put the cave on the map. Put Father's methods in the record. Put the findings in the hands of people who can replicate them elsewhere. That's what the documentation was for. Ward was quiet for a long moment. Then carefully, I'll dedicate the paper to Edmund Hale, and the acknowledgments will make the attribution of the original work unambiguous. Both of you. He picked up his notebook. The knowledge will travel with your name attached to it, Miss Hale, whether you put it on the title or not. That's also how documentation works. The paper was published in the autumn of 1887 in 2 journals, simultaneously the agricultural and the geological, and it generated correspondence that Ward forwarded to Clara in batches over the following year. Settlements in Montana and Colorado and the Northern Plains territories wrote asking for the specific soil amendment, ratios, the temperature thresholds, the harvest rotation schedules. A farming cooperative in Minnesota built a modified version of the system using a natural spring whose thermal properties they had not previously considered exploitable. A letter from a government surveyor in Idaho Territory asked whether Hale's methods could be adapted for a larger geothermal feature his team had identified near a planned settlement. She answered every letter. She answered them in the cave by lantern and light in the third journal she had begun after filling the second writing in the careful notation system that had begun with Edmund's first entry in 1883 and that had now accumulated enough observation to constitute something she could not yet name, but that felt in its accumulated weight like the beginning of a field. The summer of 1887 transformed the cave's relationship to Crestfall from emergency resource to established institution in the quiet, incremental way that genuine changes occur, not with ceremony, but with the slow revision of assumptions. Gustav's stone staircase into the ravine was completed in August, 42 steps cut into the rock face, and mortared with the precision that characterized his work with rope handholds on the eastern wall at intervals calculated for the shortest adult's reach. The staircase changed who could access the cave previously. It had required agility and a tolerance for loose shale. Now the doctor's elderly patients could descend with assistance. Mothers could bring children. The cave stopped being a resource that Clara managed for the community and became a place the community had a relationship with directly. She had mixed feelings about this, which she examined honestly in the journal, rather than resolving them falsely. The cave had been her private work for 8 months, her father's secret, and then her project, and then in the worst weeks of the winter, her only certainty. Opening it fully to the community's foot traffic and casual presence cost something that she didn't try to minimize or feel guilty about. The privacy of a place is part of its character, and changing that character changes the place. And there was a version of the cave she had known in January that no longer existed and would not exist again. But the purpose of the cave, the purpose her father had spent 3 years building toward, was not privacy. It had never been about keeping a secret. It had been about doing the work correctly before the secret was released, which was a different thing entirely. Edmund had not hidden the cave because he wanted it for himself. He had hidden it because he needed time to make it worth finding. By September, Edith's preservation operation had expanded to employ 6 women from the settlement processing cave produce into forms that could be stored and traded across a geographic range that extended to 3 neighboring settlements. The work was technically straightforward, but organizationally complex, and Edith managed it with the executive precision she had previously applied to managing social appearances, the same underlying capacity redirected. She had found the version of herself that her intelligence had always been reaching toward and not quite finding in the constraints of Percival's household and Crestfall's social expectations. She was harder and more interesting in this version and considerably less interested in managing other people's surfaces. Thomas had used the spring and summer to establish a transport arrangement that connected Crestfall to 3 other communities on a regular schedule, the horse and wagon forming the backbone of a small but functional supply network. He had found in the logistics of this operation the seriousness that youth and ease had previously allowed him to defer. He made decisions now in the particular way of someone who has learned that decisions have consequences that extend beyond the moment of making them. And this learning had cost him something and produced something, and both of these facts were legible in how he carried himself. Robert's stone steps were in the ground, and his contribution to the practical infrastructure of the cave was real and not nothing. He did not come to the cave often, it was not his territory, and he understood that without it being said. But when the community discussed its future in the informal meetings that Crestfall held at the church on winter evenings, he was consistent and clear in his position. The cave was Clara's, the methods were Edmund's, and any commercial development of either required her agreement. Coming from the man who had offered her $20 for a quit claim transfer 11 months earlier, this represented a kind of reckoning that public positions sometimes accomplish more efficiently than private ones. The second winter arrived in November 1887, and Crestfall met it with the specific confidence of a community that has survived the worst version of a thing and knows in its bones that it can survive the ordinary version. The cave was stocked, the relay system was established, the preservation stores were deeper than they had ever been, and Dr. Merritt's nutritional protocols meant that the community entered the cold season without the accumulated deficiencies that had made the previous winter so dangerous. The child Hendricks and old man Pruitt, both lost in the dark weeks of 1886, were names that the community kept with the particular tenderness reserved for deaths that might have been prevented. On a Tuesday evening in late November, Clara sat alone in the second chamber after the day's work was done. The garden was at full production, 3 expansion rounds completed since the spring, the original east side beds now in their third growing cycle, with root systems that had built themselves into the soil structure deeply enough that the yield per plant had increased measurably over the first season. Edmund's notation system filled 4 journals now. The walls of the chamber held the evidence of 2 years of continuous cultivation in the way that working spaces hold their history, not in disorder, but in the accumulated presence of tools positioned by habit surfaces, worn smooth by repeated contact, the specific arrangement of things that have found their places through use rather than planning. She opened Edmund's original journal, the one from the box with the brass lock, with the first entry dated 3 years before his death. She had read it so many times that she could have recited sections from memory, but she didn't read it from memory. She read it from the page because the page was the thing, the actual record, the ink his hand had pressed into paper in this specific cave by lantern light, very similar to the light she was sitting in now, a continuity of physical act across the gap between his life and hers. The first entry found the pool in March. Temperature consistent with what I suspected from the steam I observed last winter rising from the ravine floor on cold mornings. The rock holds heat. The water moves. This is not an accident of geology. It is a system, and systems can be worked with. She closed the journal and held it in her lap for a moment, feeling its weight, not just the weight of the leather and pages, but the weight of 3 years of solitary work of a man who had looked at a dark hole in the earth and asked a different question than everyone else had asked. Then she set it carefully on the shelf and opened her own, the current volume, the fourth, its pages still mostly blank ahead of her. She turned to the next blank page and wrote the date at the top, and beneath the date she wrote the temperature she had taken that morning from the pool, 54 degrees. Then she wrote in the margin alongside the temperature a sentence she had been assembling from pieces over the past several months, without knowing she was assembling it. The thing about patience is that it is not the same as waiting. Waiting is passive. Patience is what you do while you are working. She looked at the sentence. She did not decide it was worth keeping or not worth keeping. She left it in the margin and continued to the next line where she began the day's record. Flint rose from his warm depression near the east wall, moved through the chamber in his measured way, checking the entrance passage, the pool edge, the garden beds, then returned and lay down again with the quiet certainty of an animal that has determined everything is in order. Above the cave, the second winter was settling over Wyoming territory, with none of the ferocity of the first and ordinary hard season rather than a historic one, and the 43 people of Crestfall were meeting it from a position of sufficiency rather than desperation. The lanterns burned steadily. The pool held its temperature. The plants continued the slow, necessary business of growing in the dark. And in the margin of the fourth journal, beside a temperature reading a sentence, sat in Clara's handwriting, true before she wrote it, and likely to remain true long after the ink faded, which was she had come to understand the only kind of thing worth writing down.